EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to the Tuesday edition of Call to Communion here on EWTN Radio. It's the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you've got a question about the Catholic faith, please consider us as a primary source to get that question answered. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us outside of North America, and we do have listeners all over the world, literally, you'll want to dial 1-205-271-2985. That's just for you folks outside of North America. 1-205-271-2985. You can always send us an email 24/7. The address for that, ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery is our producer, Matt Kaminsky our phone screener. Jeff Burson handles social media for us. If you want to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, we're streaming there live right now on this Tuesday afternoon. Just put your question in the comments box. Jeff will see that. He'll shoot it to us here in the studio. Hopefully we can answer your question on today's program. Again, the phone number 833-288-EWTN. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Very well, sir. How are you?
I'm doing decent, thank you.
How's your Advent going?
It's kind of early on in Advent. You're trying to do a few extra things Advent-y, but,
Good for you.
Yeah.
Glad to hear that. Here's an interesting email from Gabriel. This is a very personal question for you, David. Dr. Anders, recently you mentioned how your evangelical faith prior to your conversion was making you unpleasant and uncharitable in your thoughts. I really felt that comment. As a seeker, it's been something I have sensed but have been unable to articulate for a very long time. Do you have any more resources I could explore to investigate this further, and can you elaborate more? Thanks, Gabriel.
Yeah, thanks. So let me do the elaboration first, and then I'll talk about the resources. So, look, I don't want to suggest that Protestants are uncharitable. That's obviously not true. And I grew up in a very wonderful home. I had wonderful, loving parents. I had wonderful, loving grandparents. I had some very few mentors and models that were very decent people in my life who were charitable individuals. So absolutely Protestants can be charitable people. But at the heart of some versions of Protestantism and the Calvinism within which I was raised, there is an intense kind of tribal identity with the idea that I'm on the inside and you're on the outside. And in fact, I once worked at a fundamentalist Bible camp where we sang this song with the children. I'm not going to sing it, but I'll state the lyrics. One door and only one, and yet its sides are two. I'm on the inside. On which side are you? Like that. I'm on the in and you're on the out. That was a big part of the tradition.
That'd make you kind of smug, wouldn't it?
It makes you very smug. And the Calvinist doctrine of predestination and election and the idea of, the conversion as a psychological moment that you can identify on a map, and distinguishing the world between people who have had that kind of psychological experience of conversion and invited Jesus into the heart versus those that haven't, and one group's going to heaven, the other group's going to hell. That whole us-them kind of mentality is really woven very, very deeply into the tradition, and motivates a lot of their evangelizing and missionary activity. The goal of going out there and converting other people and making them like us is a big, big, big part of the tradition. At least it was when I grew up. And you hold that in concert with the idea that morality, however important, and they do think it's important, I don't want to dismiss that, morality, however important, is not what constitutes you a child of God. It's not what makes you right with God. It's not on the basis of morality that you'll be saved. God's not going to let you into heaven because you are a good person. That's very much part of the Protestant system. And so it leads to this, I think, perverse outcome. That if I'm dealing with other human beings, it is ultimately less important that I'm a good person or that they're a good person, and more important that I get them to sign on the bottom line, so to speak, and become a card-carrying evangelical Protestant, at least that they profess Christ in their heart and believe that God raised him from the dead and have a conversion experience, that sort of thing. That takes priority over the actual pursuit of virtue. And this first came home to me powerfully when I was in college. I was a Protestant. I went to Wheaton College in Illinois. And I was walking through the Wheaton bookstore, and believe it or not, Wheaton College, yes, Wheaton College, had a book by Mother Teresa.
Wow.
And I picked it up and I started reading it. And Mother Teresa told a story about pulling a dying Hindu woman off the streets of Calcutta who was being eaten alive by ants and just suffering terribly, but that her greatest suffering was the knowledge that her son had abandoned her to that state. And so she had deep bitterness and resentment against her child. And Mother Teresa nursed her wounds and cared for her, and then and loved on her and encouraged her to forgive her son. And before the woman passed, she said, I forgive my son. And she died at peace because she forgave her son. And I remember reading the story and being so impressed by it and kind of flabbergasted because it contravened many of the things that I believed as a Protestant, namely that what Mother Teresa should have done was get this woman to profess faith in Christ. And that the fact that she died without letting this woman profess Jesus meant that this woman would go to hell. And so all this forgiving of sons business was of really no benefit if she didn't have Jesus in her heart. Right? That was the way I would have seen that story as a Protestant. And I thought about that, and I realized, this is a strange outcome because it means that I am critical of Mother Teresa for helping this woman both physically and morally. Mm-hmm. And I think that it would be better, as a Protestant, at some level better to have left her in that pitiable condition, provided I could get her to profess Christ. And I thought, that seems perverse to me. And I began to notice ways that those beliefs were causing me to think in a dehumanizing or behave in a dehumanizing way towards others. When I would proselytize without a regard for an individual's inner life or their social situation or their real felt spiritual or emotional needs, just with an aim to get them to sign the bottom line and get another feather in my cap. And I began to realize that it was making me treat people in an instrumental, objectified fashion. And I thought that was really reprehensible. And so in that respect, my Protestantism was actually making me a worse human being.
Wow.
Now, did I say that it does that to everybody? No. I said that's what it did in me. And so one of the many things that led me to Catholicism was the realization that within the Catholic faith, it really is ultimately about charity.
Sure is. Gabriel, thanks for writing to us today on EWTN's Call to Communion. In a moment, we're going to get to the phones, and we've got lines open for you at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to Communion on this Tuesday afternoon here on EWTN. Stay with us.
This is Life Issues with Brad Mattis, president of Life Issues Institute.
Nothing forges a strong pro-life belief in political candidates than a personal experience. Two presidential candidates are examples. Governor Ron DeSantis shared how he and his wife lost their first pregnancy to miscarriage. He said, "It was a tough thing. We just kept the faith. We just kept praying." The experience, he said, taught him, "I've got to fight for these kids." Vivek Ramaswamy also experienced a miscarriage with their first pregnancy and had serious issues with their second. He said, "Our faith teaches us that our child joined his Creator, and one day we will too." Vivek said, "You protect all life, born and unborn." 2 Corinthians says, "God comforts us so we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received from God." Amen to that.
Follow us on social media at Life Issues Institute.
She was a mystic and reformer who died at the age of 33.
Matthew Bunson and the Doctors of the Church.
St. Catherine of Siena accomplished something no one thought possible. She convinced Pope Gregory XI to return to Rome after the popes had lived in France for almost the whole of the 14th century. They've been there ever since.
To find out more, visit EWTN.com and click on Catholicism.
Calls are coming in, emails are coming in, YouTube questions are coming in, Facebook questions are coming in. We'd love to hear from you on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. Anders, Dr. David Anders, that is. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. From time to time, you hear us talking about EWTN Media Missionaries. What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about some wonderful people, really all over the world, who prayerfully take EWTN to parishes and their community through the print and electronic media that we provide. Now, you can help EWTN share the good news by becoming a media missionary yourself. Here's what to do. Visit EWTNmissionaries.com today. That website, EWTNmissionaries.com. Join us in sharing the eternal word with the world. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. Let's begin with Rick in Minnesota, listening on the great Real Presence Radio. Hey, Rick, what's on your mind today, sir?
Oh, thank you. This is a yes or no question, believe it or not.
Okay.
But the question is the following syllogism true? Syllogism is this. If the relationship between Joseph and Mary constituted a sacramentally valid marriage, then, no matter how often they had sex, Mary was still without sin.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. I don't think it's valid, and I'll tell you why. Well, I don't think it's sound. I don't think it's a sound argument. I'll tell you why. It is true that in most cases, sexual relations are expected, in fact required, in a valid marriage, whether it's sacramental or not. Any valid marriage is generally speaking formed with the intention to procreate with some form of sexual cooperation, and that actually can be a cause for nullity. Right? If somebody purports to be married and then you find out that they entered into the state of marriage with no intention of consummation, and they weren't open to having children, and then that can actually be grounds for annulment. So under normal circumstances, that's true. But the Church does recognize something called a Josephite marriage, which is the union of a man and woman who come together in a kind of marital union. But specifically, it's been agreed upon that they will not consummate the marriage, and they're not going to be open to natural generation of children, because they have some spiritual end in mind. It's called Josephite after the Blessed Virgin and Saint Joseph. Now, in this particular case, Mary and Joseph have both taken vows of virginity. Well, at least Mary had taken a vow of virginity, and Joseph had at least taken a vow of continence, right? And so it wouldn't have been a sin against one another insofar as they were married, but it would have been to break a very solemn vow that they took to God. So I think it would have been sinful, but on other grounds, not the grounds that they were, married or not married.
Okay. Is that helpful for you, Rick?
Somewhat.
Is there something we can clear up for you?
Let me give you an analogy. This is a really silly analogy, okay?
Okay.
Let's say when I married my wife, I said, look, I'll marry you, but you only want to live in, I don't know, you want to move to Ohio. She doesn't want to move to Ohio. I'm just picking this at random.
Sure.
And so I promise you that if you marry me, we'll move to Ohio. Okay?
Okay.
And we get married, and then I say, I'm not moving to Ohio.
Okay.
Right? Well, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with not moving to Ohio, right? But it would be wrong in this case because I was violating a vow.
Yeah.
Right? And so, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with spouses having sexual relations. In fact, that's what they're normally supposed to do.
Yeah.
Unless they vowed to one another not to, and vowed to God in a solemn way that's binding.
Rick, thanks so much for your call. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. A good time to call because we have 3 lines open right now. 833-288-3986. Tom listening to us in Twinsburg, Ohio on AM 1260 The Rock. Hey there, Tom. What's on your mind today, sir?
What is the morality of lawsuits? I believe I know that St. Paul says we're not to engage in lawsuits, but if somebody grievously wrongs you, are you supposed to say, well, I'll just eat it and live in destitution for the rest of my life because this person cost me $500,000 and I can't sue him to get it back? Is that what the church says?
Thank you. I appreciate the question. The Church does not say that you can never pursue a lawsuit. No, it does not. And when you look at what St. Paul has to say, there's a very specific context. Paul is talking about conflicts between believers in Corinth and the scandal that would emerge if they took their case to the civil court, right?
Okay.
And he says, don't you have people in Corinth that are competent to judge these kinds of cases? So first of all, he's not saying categorically you can't go to law. He's advocating if there's a way to resolve this by mediation through the church, that's preferable. Okay.
Okay.
And particularly with respect to the sin of scandal. I think today in the 21st century, if two people who both happen to be Christians were to go to the civil court and sue one another, that would not be particularly scandalous, right, in the way that it was in the first century. Also, to the charge, isn't there someone competent to judge this in your church? I think that very often today we would have to give the judgment, no, there isn't someone competent to judge this within the church. And I'll tell you a story. This is a true story. In the Catholic Church, we still have church courts, but they don't adjudicate these kinds of cases. The church doesn't adjudicate monetary damages arising out of civil torts. We don't do that anymore at all. There used to be a time when the church did, but we don't do that at all anymore. Church courts handle matters only that pertain to ecclesiastical law.
I see.
Okay, and there are cases where you can file a canon law lawsuit against people, and I've known it to happen, right? But most of these kinds of civil cases would not be brought before a church court. But when I grew up a Presbyterian, and Presbyterians are biblicists. They want to try to take the Bible very, very straightforward, literally. And so there was a period early in my life in my home church's history when they attempted to do this. They attempted to adjudicate civil cases between litigants rather than have church members go to law in the civil courts. And my father was an attorney, and a very good one, because he had expertise in that area. They asked him, would you serve on the tribunal that oversees this kind of litigation and seeks to mediate conflict? And I remember my dad was telling me the story, and I knew where he was going. And I said, wait a minute, let me ask you. Before you tell me the end of the story, you're getting ready to tell me what happened. And I'm going to guess that the church court told the wounded person to forgive, and they vindicated the criminal. And he said that's exactly what happened.
Wow.
Right, that's exactly what happened. And so, in other words, they had a sentimental criteria, which is that Christians should always forgive, and they forgot about the demands of justice. And so, in his view, rather than doing justice, they actually brought about a great injustice. And so he went to the pastor of the church and he said, never ask me to serve on one of these things again. I don't want my name tarnished with this kind of enormity, this kind of atrocity, right? They're not doing justice. So the answer to the question, were they competent to judge those cases? No, they weren't. They weren't competent to judge them, right? And you would be better off getting justice in the civil court. And so the kind of situation that you've raised, if someone has beggared you, then my advice would be go get a lawyer, go to court, and try to get some restitution.
Tom, thanks so much for your call today from Twinsburg, Ohio, in the greater Cleveland area. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, 833-288-3986. Harold is listening to us in Texas on iHeartRadio. Hello, Harold. What's on your mind today, sir?
Yes, sir. I want to know, where do you stand, or how do you feel about saying the Rosary every day?
Thanks, Harold. Good? Yeah, I really appreciate the question. So I think it depends. And the value of any Catholic devotion is judged by whether it helps advance you in the life of virtue and charity. That's the criterion. And any Catholic devotion, and for that matter, any Catholic spiritual act, can be efficacious, can be powerful, can be edifying, or it can be done superstitiously. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 2111, I think, actually says that the sacraments of the Church themselves can be taken in a superstitious manner. So if it's possible to take Holy Communion superstitiously, even more so, it's possible to take the Rosary superstitiously. And so we can't say of any Catholic act, any devotional act, any liturgical act, that by itself it's necessarily always effective to bring us to holiness. It depends upon our disposition. It's effective in us insofar as we are disposed to seek the truth in charity. Right? For many people, the Rosary has been powerfully efficacious to unite them to Christ through the intercession of Our Lady and helped them to grow in holiness. And if that is the situation, then by all means, dive into the Rosary with both feet and pray it all the time. However, I personally have also seen it happen that I'm not going to impugn the Rosary, but I've seen devotionalists, right, that have their favorite devotion, who take it in a mechanical and superstitious way, as a way of lording it over others, as a way of distinguishing themselves from their neighbors with their self-assertive piety, who don't seem to develop charity or humility or holiness. I wouldn't say to such people, stop that devotion. I would say to them, reframe how you're using it. Reframe how you're using it. St. Francis de Sales, I think, is a great model and instructor in this. His book, The Introduction to the Devout Life, talks about this very thing. In the first few chapters of The Introduction to the Devout Life, St. Francis says, what is devotion? Is it praying the Rosary? Is it fasting? Is it alms to the poor? And he says it's none of these things. True devotion is nothing other than the genuine love of God and neighbor. And whatever you can do that will bring you to the genuine love of God and neighbor is for you the right devotion, is for you the right spirituality. The Church has many devotions, many spiritualities. You find the one in your life that helps you the most to the imitation of Christ. If that's the Rosary, go for the Rosary. Famously, some saints lived by the Rosary, others didn't like it. Therese of Lisieux, not a big fan of the Rosary, right? John Paul II, huge fan of the Rosary. Both of them came to holiness.
There you go. Harold, thanks so much for your call today. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Deborah's watching us on YouTube this afternoon. Deborah says, hi, Dr. Anders, can you tell me why you chose Catholicism and not Orthodoxy? And if you know the answer here, why do most converts from Protestantism choose Catholicism rather than Orthodoxy?
Sure. So several reasons. First of all, I think primarily because I tend to take Christ seriously in Matthew 16 when he talks about the role of St. Peter and the patron office in the church, right? That's a key Catholic doctrine, that Peter is the rock and he has the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and his successors, the bishops of Rome, also possess those keys. So the doctrine of the papacy is, of course, central to Catholic identity. That's not negligible, and I found the biblical and historical arguments for that to be compelling. I also I recognize that there are different ways to be Catholic, that it was open to me to not only be Catholic, but to say be an Eastern Rite Catholic. Maybe I could embrace the spiritual and theological patrimony of the East without renouncing the papacy. And I know Protestants that have converted to Catholicism, but in its Eastern rites. But I also considered the fact that this is just idiosyncratic to me. I'm a Westerner. Like I'm part of the Latin Patriarchate. Right? This is my culture, and so the heritage of Western civilization is Roman Catholic. And so I felt a great affinity to it from an aesthetic and personal dimension as well. So I think doctrinally, I thought that this is the appropriate place for me to be.
Okay.
But also, sort of my heritage spoke to that. The Pope he's the Bishop of Rome and has universal jurisdiction of the entire Church. But he's also the Patriarch of the West, right? I also thought that there were some difficulties within Orthodoxy that I think are more or less insurmountable. From a theoretical point of view, and one of them is I don't think there's a principled way to distinguish between rival claimants to the title Orthodoxy. Right? There are at least three major schools of Orthodox identity. There's the Chalcedonian, the non-Chalcedonian, and the Nestorian branches of Orthodoxy. They all lay claim to the mantle of orthodoxy and apostolicity and tradition. And yet they can't agree with one another because they don't have the same list of ecumenical councils. And there's just no way to get out of that circle. Right? And so without a definitive voice who possesses the keys that can ultimately validate, this is the correct list of councils, I don't see how you can adjudicate those disputes, right? And so it's just arbitrary otherwise. Now I think there's a tremendous amount of value in the Eastern patrimony of the Church, Orthodox or Catholic, I'm really fond of a lot that I find in Orthodoxy. I'm fond of the liturgy. I'm really fond of the Fathers. I'm fond of the theological and philosophical tradition. And so I don't do a very good job of this, but when John Paul said the church has to breathe with 2 lungs, I'm always, have an eye to try to filling that one lung that I want to get full, from the East. So it's a great contribution to the faith and to the world, and it's a spirituality that needs to be cultivated, but I don't have to be Orthodox to do that.
And regarding why do most converts choose Catholicism rather than Orthodoxy? Is it because
I don't have any statistics right now on the proportion of Protestant converts to Orthodoxy versus Catholicism. I can't pass judgment on that.
Okay.
But I think those that choose the Catholic faith do so for the reasons I just articulated.
Very good. And Deborah, thanks so much for watching us on YouTube on this Tuesday afternoon. In a moment, we're going to talk with Vanessa in Woodburn, Oregon, Carrie in Illinois, and hey, look at this, a line available for you. How about that? 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986 for Call to Communion.
This is a Messy Family Minute with Mike and Alicia Hernan. Most families celebrate holiday traditions, but do we appreciate why traditions are so important? Your family's traditions are built around what your family values, and they strengthen your family culture, communicating to your children more powerfully than any written word. If you value your Catholic faith, then you should have traditions in your home which communicate its importance.
During the Advent and Christmas season, it's so easy for us to get caught up with what the world values and neglect to do the things that reflect what we as a family truly value. Take the time to light your Advent wreath and say a prayer or read scripture each night. Create decorations that reflect Catholic ideals and display them. Read the Christmas story or have your own children do a Christmas pageant for your family. These are all traditions which communicate your values more powerfully than anything you can say. And when they're repeated year after year, they will be firmly planted within the heart of your child. This is why traditions for the Catholic family are so important.
For more ideas and insights into family culture, visit us at messyfamilyminute.org.
Proclaiming the faith, changing lives.
The year was 1980. Mother Angelica, who is hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, orders a satellite dish and transmission equipment. A wealthy benefactor gives her the $250,000 letter of credit she needs to apply for an FCC license to broadcast.
To learn more about Mother Angelica's life and the history of EWTN, visit EWTN.com/Mother Angelica.
The words of Blessed Carlo Acutis.
When we face the sun, we get a tan. But when we stand before Jesus in the Eucharist, we become saints. By standing before the Eucharistic Christ, we become holy.
Hi, this is Janet Williams. We embrace the essence of feminine spirituality on Women of Grace tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern here on EWTN Radio. Now, back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, or perhaps you'd like to explain what is stopping you from becoming a Catholic, 833-288-3986. Congratulations going out to another member of the EWTN radio family, and that would be WSFI in the greater Chicagoland area, celebrating 10 years with us. They're on an FM station. They're on a great big AM station. Congratulations to Angela Tomlinson and everybody at WSFI from your friends here at EWTN Radio. Congratulations. All right, let's go to Vanessa now, a first-time caller in Woodburn, Oregon, listening on the great Modern Day Radio. Hello, Vanessa. What's on your mind today?
Hello. I was just wondering if you are not a Catholic and you take the Eucharist in the Catholic Church, is that a sin?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So, first of all, the Church does not invite Protestants generally to partake of communion in the Catholic Church. Except in one rare circumstance, and that is if the Protestant in question is in danger of death and has Catholic faith in the sacraments. So if the Protestant holds what the Catholics teach about the Eucharist to be true and is personally in great danger of death, then the Church would admit that Protestant to communion. But that's obviously very rare.
Sure.
Now, it sometimes happens that a Protestant might go to communion in the Catholic Church in ignorance of the Catholic teaching and do so with a clean conscience and a good will, And I would say that such an act of communion would be inadvisable, not prudent, but not necessarily sinful, because that person acted in ignorance. They didn't do it deliberately. They weren't doing anything wrong on purpose. So the question is, why does the Catholic Church not admit Protestants normally to Holy Communion? Well, there are a couple of reasons. Let's get one misconception out of the way right away. Sometimes you'll hear Catholics say, well, you can't go to communion because you don't believe in the real presence. That's not the reason. That's not the reason. There are plenty of Catholics that believe in the real presence who shouldn't go to communion. Right? That's just not a sufficient explanation. The reason that some Catholics themselves can't go to communion is if they have knowledge of grave sin and they have not yet had access to sacramental confession. Right? So St. Paul tells us that if we go to communion unrepentant, then we are doing ourselves no good. We're actually harming our spiritual lives. Right? And this is because Catholics view what communion is, its very nature and function, differently from Protestants. For Protestant, communion is just a reminder of God's undifferentiated, inexhaustible goodwill towards us, that Christ died for us and loves us and wants to bring us to himself. Now, all those things are true, but there's something else for a Catholic going on, that communion is part and parcel of an act of sacrifice. The very word host, which is what we mean, the word we use for the communion wafer, the very word host comes from the Latin word that means sacrificial victim, right? And we think that in going to communion, we're making an offering to God, and unlike the Old Testament sacrifices where you had to be ritually pure on the outside, the sacrifice of the New Covenant is a sacrifice of our interior life. It's made pure in holiness. That's our essential act of worship. And so having that interior life adequately purified and cleansed and reconciled to God is necessary to make that act of sacrifice in a worthy manner, right? And the Church has authority to adjudicate that question, to determine whether or not you're worthy to go to communion. And the forum for doing that is the confessional. Catholic priests have the right and the duty to judge the consciences of Catholics. So if a Catholic presents himself for confession, the priest can form the judgment, this person is contrite, I absolve them, they can safely go to communion. Mm-hmm. Precisely because the Church does not judge non-Catholics. I want to get this really straight. Right? When we say you can't go to communion, we're not judging you. We're doing the opposite of judging you. The Church judges that some Catholics can go to communion and some Catholics cannot go to communion. She refuses to make that judgment about Protestants, because they are not subject to the Church's jurisdiction, because they don't have access, they don't avail themselves of the confessional. Then the tribunal that judges their fitness for communion is not active. And so it's not safe for them to go to communion, right? Because this is an act of holy sacrifice. Yeah. What if a sinner presents himself for communion, with a bad conscience and no desire to amend his life? And the Church has had no ability to adjudicate that question. Well, we're not doing him any favors. We're not doing him any favors. Right. Here's another reason why it's inadvisable for Protestants to go to communion in the Catholic Church. The act of communion in the Catholic Church is not just a testament to my personal relationship with Jesus. It is, in fact, a corporate act. It is an act that signals my belonging to a corporate body, namely the institutional Catholic Church. By going to communion, I am signaling my agreement and my adherence and my submission to the Catholic faith. I'm saying by my actions, I believe everything that this church teaches, and I submit myself to its authority. That's what the act means. That's not what it means for Protestants. Many times when a Protestant goes to communion, he simply means, this is me and my private Jesus. That's not what it means for a Catholic. It's not me and my private Jesus. It's me and the church that is his body. And so when a Protestant presents himself in the Catholic Church for communion, he is saying ritually, I believe the Catholic faith and submit to its authority. But why would we want to encourage people to testify against themselves in that way? If the Protestant does not believe the Catholic faith and does not submit to its authority, then it makes no sense for him or her to partake of the rite that declares to the world, I agree with this faith and submit to its authority. Now, there is a pernicious reason why a Protestant might want to go ahead and commune anyway, and that is because the Protestant wishes to insist that there is no substantial difference between Catholicism and other forms of Christianity, that he wants to, by his act of communion, wishes to signal his belief that his Christian faith is on a par with the Catholics and there's no substantial difference, and Catholicism is just one denomination among many. In that case, what he is doing is not communing with Christ. He is registering a protest vote against Catholic theology. You follow me?
Yeah.
And so that would be disingenuous. So it's for a Protestant to not receive communion in the Catholic Church does not mean that that Protestant is cut off from Jesus. He may very well have Jesus living in his heart, right? So we're not saying that you're going to go to hell or you're not close to the Lord. None of those things are implied, right? I've given the reasons why, right? Finally, I would say there might be a form of superstition in the Protestant's desire to receive communion in the Catholic Church if the Protestant thinks that by receiving communion, just in virtue of the ritual act, that I'm somehow like getting pumped up on Jesus' power, right? That just the fact of communion itself is sufficient to do that. And that would be a misunderstanding of the rite of communion, because the Church teaches that, yes, there is supernatural power there, but to access that, to make it effective in my life, I must have the proper disposition. And that proper disposition is Catholic faith towards the sacraments, believing everything the Church teaches, submission to its authority, and the proper desire to amend my life. But if you have all those things, if you have Catholic faith, you have a desire to submit yourself to the Church's authority and to become holy in the way the Church teaches, then why not just go ahead and become Catholic?
Absolutely. Vanessa, we hope that's helpful for you. Thanks so much for your call from Woodburn, Oregon this afternoon. Call to Communion here on EWTN. We have a praise report from Angie watching on Facebook this afternoon. Angie says, my catechumen group of 70 were initiated into the church this weekend. I am so excited to be on this journey, and I ask that y'all pray for us. Thank you, Dr. Anders. Again, that's from Angie in North Carolina.
Well, to take a phrase from my mother, hot diggity dog.
Yeah.
That's great news. Thank you so much.
Welcome home, Angie. Glad to have you on board here. Call to Communion on EWTN. Diana's listening in Tampa on the TuneIn radio app. Hello, Diana. What's on your mind today?
Thank you so much. Thank you, David. Yes, I have a question. I was talking to my husband last night, and something came up on the news about this guy who, so many years after, he confessed to his daughter that he was a bank robber. He was a thief, and nobody could know this. And then he died. He passed away, so his daughter was the same, this on the news. And so my husband said, I said, well, if he didn't pay here, somehow he's going to pay before. I just said, I don't know. I said, he's going to pay at the end of his life. I mean, he's probably already in purgatory. I don't know. I just said it like that. And my husband was, well, how did you know that? He probably repented, and he may go to heaven because Jesus said that's the thief on the cross. He's going to paradise, blah, 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 all we know. And I said, well, because you still have to cleanse yourself. Still, he may have not repented. We don't know this, so we don't know the end, but that's what it is. So he said, well, he didn't say to the thief that he was going to purgatory on the cross. He didn't say he had to go through something. He said, well, he didn't have to.
Yep, I can help you. I can totally help you. So there's a lot going on with St. Dismas. That's the name tradition has given to the thief on the cross. There's a lot going on with St. Dismas that our Protestant friends fail to notice. First of all, St. Dismas did not simply make an act of faith. See, the Protestant position is you can get saved by making an act of faith alone. That's not what Dismas did. He didn't simply make an act of faith. I want you to consider all that Dismas did when he was dying on the cross. First of all, Dismas made an act of tremendous humility. That's an act of virtue, right? By saying, Lord Jesus, remember me when you come in your kingdom. Dismas bore witness to the authority of Christ before others, rebuking the thief who was criticizing Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Dismas submitted both to divine providence and acceptance of the punishment meted out against him, saying, I'm getting what my deeds deserve. Now, Catholic position is if a criminal accepts the judicial punishment against him as just, that act of acceptance has expiatory value. It is, as it were, like a kind of purgatory. So it is very possible for a criminal who is in the penal justice system to experience that civil punishment in a way that makes it count as atonement for sin. Now, if you do that, if you do penance in this life adequately, you don't go to purgatory. And everything that we know about St. Dismas on the cross suggests that that's exactly what he did. He did make an act of faith, but he also made an act of humility. He also accepted the punishment against him as expiation for his sins. He bore witness to Christ. I mean, he did a ton.
A lot.
And for that reason, Christ was able to say to him in justice, "You will be with me today in paradise." It wasn't by faith alone.
Okay. We hope that's helpful for you and for your husband as well, Diana. Thanks for checking in today in Tampa. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Be sure to join us for EWTN News Nightly tonight, 9 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio and Television with Tracy Sable. Some of the stories we're following, several university presidents are on Capitol Hill today facing questions about anti-Semitism on campuses. Plus, Israel pushes further into southern Gaza. You may have heard about that. They're now looking to go for the whole country there. We're going to bring you the latest on the offensive and evacuation efforts. Again, that's EWTN News Nightly, tonight, 9 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio and Television. Sackett is watching us on YouTube this afternoon. Sackett says, is it a mortal sin to vent, complain, or grumble to yourself about something or someone? It's technically not slander or gossip, since you're really talking to yourself, not to somebody else.
Yeah, thanks. So it wouldn't be the sin of slander or detraction or calumny, but it could very well be the sin of ingratitude.
Oh.
Right, could be the sin of ingratitude. Could be the sin of failing to accept divine providence. It's also psychologically a bad idea, right? So if you consider, like, what is the end of psychotherapy? You go to your therapist. Generally speaking, it's to enable people to be able to accept their circumstances. You know, someone has a traumatic event, or maybe they lose a leg or something, and they're traumatized, but having a hard time adjusting. The point of psychotherapy is not to grow new legs. Is to help people cope with the situation that they have. That's good, decent sense. It's like psychological well-being. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, said, don't desire for things to be other than the way they are. Desire for them to be the way they are, and you'll get on well, right? So there's also a mandate in Catholic moral theology to do the reasonable thing. Mm-hmm. Sin, St. Thomas Aquinas says, from one point of view, is nothing but an irrational act. To act irrationally is what sin means. So since we can tell in reason that it is in our psychological best interest to accept things that have happened to us and not to rail against them purposelessly, I say on two grounds then we could conclude that it is potentially sinful. One, for being intrinsically irrational. Two, for evidencing a lack of gratitude. Do I grumble personally? To myself, man, I am the world's chief grumbler. I grumble constantly. It is a vice of mine that I work actually, I don't work very hard to eliminate, and I should work hard to eliminate. And for me, the grumbling often takes the form of kicking myself in the backside for things that I regret from the past.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Doesn't do me any good. Doesn't do me any good. So I'm sympathetic to the question, but I do think it's problematic.
Sackett, thanks so much for checking in today on YouTube. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Alicia Marie in Tallahassee called in. Alicia Marie says, Dr. Anders, I wasn't really raised with much religious education outside of a relationship with Jesus. So what is meant by the term Protestant?
Yeah, so the term Protestant first emerged in the late 1520s to describe people that followed the theology of Martin Luther against the teaching of the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church has been around for 2,000 years, but there was a movement in the early 16th century in Germany, spearheaded by a monk named Martin Luther, to protest against certain Catholic doctrines and practices that eventually became a new ecclesial organization, a new kind of church. And so you would probably know the offshoots of this movement in things like Presbyterianism, the Baptist Church, maybe the Bible Church or the non-denominational church down your street, or the Episcopal Church or the Methodist Church. All of those are examples of what we call Protestant churches because they're an outgrowth of the protest movement that was initiated by Martin Luther in 1517, and then the term Protestant began to be applied to those who followed him in the late 1520s, early 1530s. So it's Christians that are not Catholics and they're not Eastern Orthodox that tend to follow the teaching of Martin Luther or his associates. That's what the word Protestant means.
There you go. And Alicia Marie, thanks so much for calling today here on EWTN's Call to Communion. Interesting, kind of a tough question here from Derek. Derek says, I cannot help but think the Roman Catholic Church is disintegrating and collapsing under the same pressures that are causing what appears to me to be the same pressures that are causing the collapse of Western civilization. What are your thoughts about the state of society and the Church?
Yeah, thank you. So the Catholic Church is actually growing contemporaneously and quite substantially. But most of the growth is happening in Africa and Asia. So the absolute numbers of Catholics just keeps going up and up and up, and the rate of growth is highest in those places. It is having a difficult time in Europe, very difficult time in Europe, and a pretty difficult time in North America. And we're losing more Catholics than we're gaining in North America, and they've lost them in Europe by and large. So there are problem areas, but Catholicism in general, the world over, is actually in a growth phase right now. You wanted to know if I thought the disintegration of the church, and I'll just limit that to Europe and North America, is related to the disintegration of Western civilization. Well, absolutely, 100%. I mean, since the history of Western civilization is thoroughly Christianized and is wrapped up with Christian identity and the Catholic faith, yeah, the two kind of go hand in hand. As you dissolve the institution of Christian culture from Western civilization, and you don't fill them with something that meets the spiritual void that was left behind, yeah, you're going to have that problem, sure.
There you go. Derek, thanks so much for your email. Savannah's calling in. She is a first-time caller from Oklahoma, listening on the great Oklahoma Catholic Broadcasting. Hello, Savannah. What's on your mind today?
Hi, I just had a question. So my fiance has not been to confession in over 10 years, and I've been with him for the past 5, and he is a cradle Catholic. I hope that's not an offensive term. I wasn't raised Catholic, so that's just what they say.
Sure. That's fine. That's fine.
And I converted 2 years ago from having no religion, growing up with no religion whatsoever, and so I've kind of taken the reins and said, okay, if we're going to do this and have a Catholic wedding, we're going to be fully Catholic. So I said that I would like him to go to confession before we get married. And so he's finally taking me up on that. And I am just afraid that he is unbeknownst to a lot of the sins that he has done purely because he doesn't recognize them and doesn't have someone to, I don't want to say point them out, but like.
Oh, I got you, Savannah. Let me ask you a couple of questions, if I could. Let me make sure I get the story straight. So you're a recent convert to Catholicism. Your fiance, I missed this. What's his relationship to the Catholic faith at present? Did he become Catholic?
He is a cradle Catholic.
Okay. He's a cradle Catholic. You're a convert, but he hasn't been overly enthusiastic about his faith. Hasn't maybe learned it very well. Hasn't practiced it very avidly. You're calling him back to a more vigorous practice of the Catholic faith. Okay, I got that. And he's going to go to confession. You've asked him to, and you're worried that he maybe won't make a great confession. Here is my advice to you, right? Both as a Catholic thinker as well as a Catholic husband. The question of whether he makes a good confession or not should absolutely never concern you ever once in your entire marriage. For the sake of his soul and for the sanity of your home and for the integrity of your marriage, never tell him what to say in confession. Never tell him what to do in confession. Never interrogate him about what he said in confession. Never ask him about it. Never give him a hard time about it. Leave it entirely uncoerced. Here's why. Because if you do anything other than that, the odds that he will come to resent you or the sacrament are very high. You let the Holy Spirit and the priest do the job of speaking to his conscience. You do the job of loving him, all right? And just be a good wife to him. You practice your own faith with integrity and virtue and enthusiasm. Let it change you and make you wonderful and long-suffering and patient and kind and all those things in 1 Corinthians 13 that we so often read at weddings. Let that be your character. Let's let judgmentalism not be one of those things, right? I made a decision in my own marriage and family years ago that I would never tell my kids or my wife ever once what to say in confession. And I'm so glad I stuck to that rule. And they all have kind of a different everybody has their own relationship with the church. Not all my kids are like me. My wife's not like me. But some of them developed very healthy relationships with the sacraments on their own because they're their own people. They have their own consciences. Look, if you drag him along to Mass, if you get him back involved in the Catholic faith, the instruction, the catechesis, the Catholic culture, that will work on him. That's its job. Like it will. And remember the Catholic principle of gradualism. Gradualism means that you don't have to get him to perfect sanctity tomorrow, right? Just let him live as a Catholic. And the fact of being a Catholic person in communion with the Catholic Church and communion with the sacraments, that will have an effect on him. It's possible to make a confession that is somewhat ignorant, that maybe is not the same confession that a better formed person would make, but is made with sincerity and goodwill. Maybe this person doesn't have a full understanding of the Church's moral catechesis. That's okay. The fact that they're there with goodwill, and that's key, that they're really there with goodwill and a desire to do the right thing, goes a long way. And the priest hopefully will have the pastoral sensitivity to draw this individual along slowly. Now, true story. I've talked to multiple priests, good, Orthodox, faithful, devout, loving priests, who have shared with me something of their philosophy on this matter. And I've been indicated to me more than once, by more than one priest, that they don't think it's their job in that moment to correct every single fault of the human personality, right? And that they recognize that people advance in the Catholic faith in stages, and the mere fact of showing up for some people is a tremendous triumph, I know of converts and of reverts who have come into the Catholic faith, and their first confession was a terrible experience because they met with what they took to be a judgmental attitude. And for them, it was such a hurdle just to get in the door. And then rather than encouragement, what they got was criticism. And they said, I'm never going back, right? So just let it be positive for him. His concession to go is tremendously important. It's valuable. It shows his love and devotion to you. Let that be enough for now. The growth will happen. Give it time. It could take decades. Give it time.
Love that statement about, I'm probably getting it wrong, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.
Single step.
Absolutely. Thank you, Savannah. Thank you for your call. Quick question from Carol. Listening to your show yesterday gave me pause. I thought final judgment at the end of time was to show us how our lives and actions affected those around us, the good we did and the wrong. All actions have repercussions, and to see how the choices we made was kind of like seeing a stone tossed in a lake and the ripples that it caused. Why is this incorrect?
Well, if you're reconciled to God and your life is characterized by virtue and charity, which is what it means to be sanctity, then the final judgment may very well, in your case, be a celebration. Maybe it's a congratulation. Maybe it's praise, right?
Yeah.
And the purpose is not going to be to make you feel bad for all the bad things that you did. Presumably, you've already done that through the act of contrition, right? If you've gone to confession in the past and you were contrite for your sins, you knew they were wrong and hurtful, and you were sorry, and you're forgiven.
Well,
and you've done penance.
Yeah, all that. Well, thank you so much for your email, Carol. Glad we could close on a very high note there. Dr. David Anders, thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
We do this show Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. You can check out the podcast anytime you wish by going to EWTN.com/radio. Then look for the word that says podcast. That's all you have to do. And looking forward to our next visit. Hope that you're with us on the Wednesday afternoon edition of Call to Communion. On behalf of our fantastic team here, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. Thanks for joining us. See you tomorrow on the Wednesday edition of Call to Communion. Have a wonderful day. God bless you. And have a wonderful Advent as well. God bless.
December is the month dedicated to the Immaculate